Welcome to the Hanshaw's Horizon podcast, where we explore learning science and all the tools you need to create a high-performance learning environment. Today, we're going to dive in and look at some theories and strategies to help you create that high-performance learning environment, whether you're an instructor or instructional designer. Welcome to Hanshaw's Horizon podcast, where we explore learning science and everything that it takes to make a high-performance learning environment. And today, I've had a lot of questions. Well, not today, but over the past couple of weeks, I've had a lot of questions about leading high-performing teams, specifically leading high-performing teams where folks on those teams are highly creative. And that's one of my favorite topics because I love continually learning about leading. I tend to be a student of leadership forever. I don't think we can ever learn enough. And I also think that if we're stuck on thinking about, what's my leadership style, or what do I want to follow Cotter's change model, things like that, you're already out of date. I think we have to meet people where they are, and we have to create and cultivate the environment where people can be high performing, because when you have high performance, you have an environment that is absolutely amazing. You don't just throw seeds out into a garden and hope that it grows, right? And water it a little bit. You cultivate the soil, you cultivate the environment. Then you plant the seeds, then you water, and you continue to cultivate even as it grows. So we never stop as that gardener or as that leader. We always want to feel the burden of leadership and understand that it is a privilege to lead. And as we move forward, always learn. So what I personally do is I've broken things down into two categories, strategic and tactical. You've probably heard that many, many times, but the way I have it might be a little bit different, and it works for me. And I think that you can take any of this and use it whatever way you like to lead creative teams and create high-performing teams, because it's all about creating that environment, especially the tactical parts. That's where it gets really wild, because one thing that may work for one team won't work for another. But the strategic pieces that we're going to discuss quickly, those work across the board. And the reason why they do is because we've kind of zoomed out and moved away from, you're this type of leader, you're that style of leader. Like I said, if we're talking about that, you're moving backwards right now. So we want to know what works, what creates that high performing team, and how do I meet employees? How do I meet team members? How do I meet my team where they are? And the first thing is, anybody want to take a wild guess? It's the exact same thing. I've had a podcast earlier about creating a high performance classroom. The exact same thing creates a high performance team. And we actually know more about high performance business teams and psychological safety, which is the key, the number one ingredient of a high performing team, because psychological safety is that environment or culture. Because remember, culture eats content for lunch. Peter Drucker said culture eats strategy for breakfast. Absolutely. Culture eats content for lunch if we're talking about learning. So we're talking about leading a team and creating a high-performing team, whether they're, creative, not creative, whatever they may be. Psychological safety is by far the number one ingredient. And I really love Tim Clark's book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, where he talks about inclusion safety, which is the number one, which is the first stage of the 4 stages of psychological safety. And that is a basic human right. And it is the only stage of the 4 stages that is not earned, because the next stages are earned, and that is learner safety, contributor safety, and then challenger safety. So psychological safety may not be exactly what you're thinking, because it's not about niceness or a team getting along. There's actually friction, creative friction and intellectual friction within high-performing teams. So teams that have a high level of psychological safety, they aren't afraid to have that friction and have those conversations that really utilize that friction to help the team grow. Because think of it like a car. You can have a supercar, but if it doesn't have tires on it, you can have that engine revving and it can be going and it's ready to go, and it's a supercar engine, so it's making a lot of noise. If you don't have the wheels, the tires that are touching the ground, it's never going to have that friction to make it move forward. So you always need to have that friction in order to grow, in order to move forward. And the definition of psychological safety from Tim Clark is rewarded vulnerability. So you have to be able to be vulnerable. Individual team members feel free to be vulnerable, put out ideas, and not basically get squashed, if you will, from whatever, from the team leader or the other people on the team just really piling on and making you feel bad for even bringing up an idea that wasn't fully formed, right? We've all probably been part of that team, but we're going to talk about psychological safety as a strategy on its own as well. We're going to do that in another podcast, because the next two actually come from Jocko Willink, and his two books, Extreme Ownership and Dichotomy of Leadership, talk about, well, the first book, Extreme Ownership, talks about extreme ownership. We're going to get into that in a second. And his other book, Dichotomy of Leadership, also bring up the 4 laws of combat, is what he calls them. And that is cover and move, so teamwork, right? And then keep things simple, because when things are simple, they tend to hold up under stress. When things are very complex and then stress hits, whatever that stress may be, the economy bottoming out, whatever it could be, things tend not to break under stress when they're simple. When they're complex, they fall apart under heavy stress. And then prioritize and execute. So we have to be able to prioritize and execute. And then my personal favorite is decentralized command. That means putting the decision-making authority at the closest point to the problem or issue that is possible. And depending on what that issue is, depends on where that decision point is. But regardless whether the decision point's fairly high because it's a strategic thing, the people closest to that issue still have a voice into that decision-making process, which is very neat. So as a leader, I'm going to define the parameters that we operate within for the team, whatever that may be. And I have to explain that very clearly and very, very explicitly to the team. And when I do that, they know what they can do in terms of making decisions, things like that. They don't have to have a book that says, okay, today I can do, paragraph 2, section 1, I can make this decision. No, they have what Jocko Willink talks about is commander's intent. That's what the leader gives, the intent or the parameters of operation. And then from that, the individuals on the team figure out what they can and cannot do within there as they move. And you know what? When you have a high psychological safety, they're not afraid to ask questions, because that's learner safety. We have to be able to learn as we go. So that's kind of how these are all kind of coming together to create the leadership role that I like to call it, because it's not a style. Leadership styles, in my opinion, obsolete, but that's probably not a popular opinion, but it's mine. So psychological safety is the first one under strategy, under strategic psych safety. And then the second one are the 4 laws of combat. So what are the 4 laws of combat? Cover and move, that's teamwork. Keep things simple. Hugely important, because stress, when things are heavily stressed, high stress, complex things break. And then prioritize and execute. And then after prioritize and execute is decentralized command. And we have to be able to do that. So what happens really when we give people authority and put people in charge of things, in charge of decisions, whatever it may be that are legitimate, that also cultivates that environment, because it's all about cultivating that environment. And then the third thing under strategy, so one comes from Tim Clark, 4-stage psychological safety. And then Jocko Willink gives us the 4 laws of combat, which we'll talk about that from my perspective in another podcast as well. And we'll take a deep dive into it. The third one also comes from Jocko Willink, which is extreme ownership. Now, what is extreme ownership? Well, one of the favorite things that I've heard him say is no bad leader or no bad teams, only bad leaders. Because if you have a team that's not performing and change out that leader who cultivates that environment and supports the team, does all this, applies cover and move, keeps things simple, prioritize and execute, uses decentralized command, that leader will bring that team to high performance really quickly. I've seen it time and time again within my experience of how much a leader can affect that. It happens over and over and over again in real time. Because think about it. If I have a team, if I'm the leader and my team is not executing, and if I'm pointing fingers at my team, pointing fingers at individuals, I'm not leading, I'm blaming. But if I say, okay, my team's not performing well, what did I not do? Did I not explain the parameters of operation? Did I not coach people enough? Because when people are decision makers, sometimes they're not used to it and they need to be coached, because not every decision is a great decision, right? And you're still responsible for it. So even though you've delegated to someone to make a decision on this, you're still responsible for it because you're the leader. So you may have to shield some blowback from some poor decisions here and there. It happens. You deal with it, you move on, and you use it as a learning opportunity with the individual. So you don't say, hey, your decision was horrible. I got all this blowback. Say, okay, well, this is what happened. How do you think next time when we approach things like this, can we keep, this in mind, because we didn't really think of that when that was coming in. So you use everything as that learning opportunity. Circles back to learner safety, right? So it all comes together. But when you take extreme ownership of it, you don't blame and you look for solutions. And when you look for solutions, that's going to bring me into the tactical piece. You come in curious. So rather than come in with a judgment, you want to come in with curiosity. And the book for that one is really Marilee Adams, and she has a book, I believe it's called Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. But she talks about question thinking and being curious as opposed to judgmental. And there's many things that we can do to upgrade our curiosity. We'll have a particular podcast on that as well, but that's where we're starting to get tactical now. So we've gone from strategic, which is psychological safety, extreme ownership, 4 laws of combat. That sets up everything we do in terms of leadership. I'm not talking about strategy for the organization, although these same parameters can be used to create strategy for the organization. But I'm just talking about for the team, whether you have a small team or you're in charge of several teams, whatever it may be. The tactical piece, the strategic piece, psychological safety from Timothy Clark, 4 Stages of Psychological Safety is his book. Then you have Jocko Willink and his books. He's got multiple books. Extreme Ownership, Dichotomy of Leadership. I believe a new one just came out. The Field Manual. I'm not sure if it's new or not. I haven't read it yet, but I will. It's on my list of things to do, because as a leader, you always have to continue learning, applying everything that you learn. And with Jocko, we also get the 4 laws of combat. What I like about the laws of combat is they're grounded in sound psychological theory as well. Like, for instance, extreme ownership. Well, that has a link back to personal accountability, but it's just personal accountability to the next level. So that's why I really appreciate the way he's able to explain these concepts in a simple way. And then that drove us to the tactical pieces. So our tactical leadership pieces, which the first one was from Marilee Adams, and that is question thinking. Come in curious as opposed to judgmental. There's a saying, where you stumble, there your treasure lies. So generally, when things get tough, that's where you're going to find that treasure. So don't be judgmental about it. Be curious. That kind of goes back to decentralized command, right? So when somebody on your team makes a mistake, makes a decision, and it really wasn't the best one. We've had some blowback from it. Well, let's come in curious. Let's use it as a learning opportunity. And what's that learning opportunity? That circles back to psychological safety as well. And then the next book is Beginner's Pluck by Liz Forkin Bohanan. That is an amazing book as well, and I utilize many of the strategies that she outlines in her book, and they are just amazing. One of my favorite is Yes and. It's a game you can play with your team. So you throw something out there. Okay, so we want to be visionary of some type. We want to learn how to make, the greatest mobile learning ever. And you say, so we want to make the greatest mobile learning ever where students can do X, Y, or Z. And then other people just start piling on, but you can't look at it from a tactical perspective. You can't look at it from well, we can't do this or we can't do that. The only answer is yes, and so they pile on more good stuff. Yes, and wouldn't it be amazing if students could just get their learning, however, whatever, and then the next person, yes, and, yes, and, yes, and. And then as you go through that, you get some really strong nuggets that you can actually utilize. So if you don't take that time to dream, guess what? You're never going to know where you're going to head, because if you don't dream, then you can't really think about where you're going to go in a way that pushes you to the next level, because you always want to be pushed. You always want to be stretched. That dreaming does that. So that's one tactical way that I got from Liz Forkin Bohanan's book, Beginner's Pluck, is Yes and. Buy her book as well. Get her tactical strategies from that. Buy Marilee Adams' book, Jocko Willink's book, Timothy Clark's book, and anything from Stephen Rolnick and William R. Miller. They created this thing called motivational interviewing. Now, initially, it was about psychology and therapy, but motivational interviewing is extremely powerful in the world of business or the world of teams and leadership. Two of the things they talk about are summarizing and reflecting, and those are just two strategies that they use to really give people an opportunity to make decisions. So when we circle back to decentralized command and even challenger safety or contributor safety, when we circle back to that, motivational interviewing has a piece of that. And what is that piece? Well, when you use motivational interviewing, you're helping other people come to conclusions. So imagine that, a leader that doesn't have just this is what you should do. I forget who calls it the advice monster, but it's a great book. I'll have that on my next podcast. So I'll make sure to get that. But your advice monster comes out, right? Well, when you use motivational interviewing, you help people come to their decisions. And guess what happens if they're in charge of making a decision? They're coming to you for coaching, whatever it may be. Because remember, you're still responsible, so you have to know about it. Doesn't mean that they're just doing whatever they want. There's the parameters of operation, and you're still responsible. So you need to know what's happening. You have to have good communication. So a flattened network gives you good communication. But when you have people that, when they come to you, you help them make decisions. You help guide them as opposed to just give them a solution. Guess what? Then they begin to own it. And when they own it, I had some great advice back when I worked at Skunk Works, and I was told when you're a leader and somebody on your team has an idea, if it meets about 80% of what you think would work, let them run with it, because they will implement that infinitely better than if they were to implement your solution. So even if you have a fantastic solution, if theirs meets about 80%, doesn't have any red flags where you know it will crash and burn, they will make sure that it works infinitely better than anything you would give them. And when they have extreme ownership, circle that back. So they have extreme ownership, and then circle that back to 4 stages of psychological safety, you have now cultivated that environment where people grow and make good decisions. As a leader, if somebody makes a decision that wasn't the best, got some blowback, you know what? You need to provide the air cover for them. You need to be air cover for those decision makers on your team, the people that made the decision on your team, your teammates. You need to cover them. You need to provide air cover for them. And that is how you can really turn a group of amazing creative people into a high performing team. You cultivate that environment and let them also lead where it fits. If they're closest to the issue, then guess what? They should be the decision makers there. You have your input because the responsibility is yours. So if they make a decision, something goes wrong, you can't just point your finger. You have to say, okay, what happened? Where did I go wrong? Did I not coach enough? Did I not guide enough? What happened? And sometimes you have to check alignment as well to make sure that our goals are still aligned. So everyone on the team has the same goals. So you want to do alignment checks as well. So that's why I say there's no real leadership style that you want to have. You want to meet people where they are, take that psychological safety and use your strengths to start cultivating psychological safety for your team. And part of that is to adapt extreme ownership and adapt the 4 laws of combat, because those are all tested ways to lead a team. And then tactically use question thinking, use yes and, use motivational interviewing. And as you lead those creative teams, meet everyone where they are. So everybody needs something a little bit different from you as the positional leader. Everybody does not need the same thing. Some people need more of your time. You need to coach them a little bit closer. Others need you to just let them kind of run with something for a while and then coach them when they need it. So everybody has different needs. So that means have an EQ, have emotional intelligence, and look at each individual as an individual and see where you can help them the most. So it's not about a particular style. It's about how can I help you the most. So that's my thought. And I appreciate everybody that brought up those questions for me. In the next podcast, we're going to go over psychological safety first. That's going to be the number 1 for creating that leadership team. Then we're going to go over extreme ownership and the 4 laws of combat. And then I'm hoping to have some guests so we can do some stuff from like beginner's pluck and some question thinking. That's going to be the 3rd one. And then the next podcast after that will be on motivational interviewing and kind of how to use that from a business perspective, because we don't want the therapy approach. We want the business approach, and they're both very similar and very powerful. So Stephen Rolnick and William R. Miller, for anything to do with motivational interviewing, they are the founders of it. And I think you will have incredible success by simply using that as a part of how you cultivate that environment with your 4 stages of psychological safety from Tim Clark, and then extreme ownership and the 4 laws of combat from Jocko Willink. So have a fantastic week.